Somewhere in the high moors and stone-cut coastlines of northern Scotland, there are carved monoliths covered in symbols nobody can read. They have stood exposed to the wind for more than 1,000 years. The textbooks will tell you they were left behind by a fierce painted people who appeared in Roman records, dominated the north of Britain for centuries, and then vanished so completely that even medieval chroniclers wrote that the Picts had entirely disappeared and their language was extinct. For a long time, that was the story. A Celtic people, foreign in origin, lost to history. Then ancient DNA was extracted from the bones they left behind, and when the results came back, almost every part of that story fell apart. The Picts were never who we were told they were, and more unsettling than that, they never actually vanished. Their genetic signature is still walking around the British Isles today. To understand what the DNA overturned, you have to first understand what the DNA was overturning. And that means going back to the world the Picts emerged into, a world where the historical record had gone genuinely dark. The early Middle Ages in Britain are not known for clarity. When the Romans pulled out of the British Isles in the early 5th century, the documentary trail that had described the island for nearly 4 centuries went dim almost overnight. And in northern Scotland, it went dimmest of all. Even at the height of the empire, when the Romans were filing reports on every other corner of their world, the lands beyond Hadrian's Wall and the later Antonine Wall were treated as something else: barbarian territory, unknown country, a place where the maps gave out. It was into this fog that the Pictish emerged. The name first appears in Roman sources in the late 3rd century, applied as a general label to the people living beyond Roman power in the north of Britain. The most likely Latin origin of the word is Pictus, meaning painted, a reference to the practice of skin decoration that Caesar himself had described centuries earlier among the inhabitants of these islands, the painted ones, the barbarians beyond the wall. For most of the last 1,500 years, the textbook story about the Picts has held a familiar shape: a single Celtic people, powerful, mysterious, builders of a kingdom that came to dominate the north and east of Scotland for centuries. A people who eventually faded out of the historical record sometime in the 9th century, replaced by Gaelic-speaking Scots arriving from Ireland, leaving behind only carved stones and a handful of unanswered questions. The most enduring part of that story was their origin. The 8th century English monk Bede recorded a legend that placed the Picts somewhere far stranger than northern Britain. According to Bede, the Picts had sailed in from Scythia, an area north of the Black Sea, in a small fleet of warships. They were carried by the wind beyond the bounds of Britain. They landed in Ireland first. The Irish refused to let them stay, and so they were sent across to the empty north of Britain, where they built their kingdom and took Irish wives on the condition that succession would pass through the female line. That Scythian origin story shaped centuries of thinking about who the Picts were and where they came from. It was repeated in the 10th century Pictish chronicle. It was treated as serious evidence by scholars well into the modern period. Foreign in origin, Celtic in language, a single people, a vanished kingdom. For more than 1,000 years, that was the picture. The problem is that nearly every part of it was built before anyone could read the bones. And when the bones were finally read, the story did not survive contact with the evidence. Bede's account is worth lingering on because for centuries it was the closest thing the historical record had to an answer. The Picts, he wrote, had come from Scythia in a few warships. They were blown off course, carried beyond the furthest bounds of Britain, and washed up on the northern shores of Ireland. There they asked the Irish for permission to settle. The Irish refused, but offered them a deal. The big island to the east was empty in its northern parts. They could try their luck there. And so the Picts crossed back over the water and made their kingdom in the north of Britain. Having no wives of their own, they returned to the Irish and asked for some. The Irish agreed, but only on the condition that in cases of doubt, the Pictish kings would always be elected through the female line. The 6th century monk Gildas had told a similar tale a century and a half earlier, describing the Picts emerging from their boats like dark throngs of worms wriggling out of narrow fissures in the rock when the sun grew warm. The Pictish chronicle, written in the late 10th century, repeated Bede's Scythian story, almost word for word, and wove it into a foundation myth that medieval Scotland would carry for hundreds of years. Then in 2013, a team of researchers tested it. They extracted ancient DNA from individuals excavated at Pictish burial sites in Fife and in Easter Ross, 2 regions deep inside the historical heartland of Pictish power. They sequenced the genomes, and then they compared the results to other Iron Age Britons, to early medieval populations across the British Isles, and to the modern inhabitants of the same regions of northeastern Scotland. The findings were unambiguous. The Pictish genomes sat firmly inside the Iron Age British gene pool. There was no Scythian signal. There was no migration from the Black Sea. There was no founding population from somewhere east of the Carpathians. Using allele frequency and haplotype-based methods, the researchers placed the Pictish individuals squarely within the same genetic landscape as the rest of Iron Age Britain, with clear regional biological affinities to the populations who had lived in those exact areas for thousands of years before the name Pict ever appeared in any document. The Scythian origin story collapsed completely. The Picts had not arrived from anywhere. They had always been there. But the finding raised a stranger question. If the Picts were not foreign, and if they were not even genetically distinct from the wider Iron Age population of Britain, then what exactly made them Pictish at all? The bones said they were native. The bones said they were continuous with the long resident inhabitants of the north. The bones said the migration story was a myth, which meant the answer to who the Picts really were had to come from somewhere else entirely. The answer, when it came, was not biological. It was political. And it required setting aside one of the deepest assumptions the textbooks had ever made about the Picts. The word Pict was never an ethnic label in the way modern readers tend to imagine. It was not a tribe in the strict sense. It was not a single people with a shared bloodline and a shared origin. It was a name imposed largely from outside on a collection of long-resident northern tribes who happened to live in the same general direction. Modern historians have a term for the mistake the older accounts made. They call it the ethnic fallacy. The assumption that a name in a Roman document points to a clear-cut, well-defined ethnic community. In the case of the Picts, that assumption falls apart almost as soon as you press on it. The term first appears in Roman sources in the late 3rd century, applied as a general label to the various peoples living beyond Roman power in northern Britain. The Romans were not describing a new nation. They were renaming the same Iron Age tribes their earlier writers had already cataloged in detail. Tacitus and Ptolemy, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries, had named a whole list of distinct peoples in the north. The Caledoni, the Vacomagi, the Taixali, the Verturiones, the Venicones. By the late 3rd century, Roman writers had collapsed all of them into one convenient outsider category, the painted ones, the Picts. Even the most authoritative early medieval sources understood that this was a flattening. Bede himself admitted that Pictland, north of the Firth of Forth, was home to several distinct peoples, possibly even distinct nations. Stephen of Ripon, writing his life of St. Wilfrid in the 7th century, made the same observation. There was no single homogeneous Pictish people. There were many peoples. There was a label, and the genetic evidence agrees. The 2013 study and the broader work that has followed it found exactly what you would expect if the Picts had always been the native population of the North. Continuity with earlier Iron Age Britons. Regional biological affinities with one Pictish region resembling the Iron Age inhabitants of that region, rather than another Pictish region across the country. No single founding lineage, no unified genetic source. The DNA shows what the careful historians had already suspected. There was no Pictish race. There was no Pictish migration. There was a collection of long-resident northern British tribes who, at a particular moment in the early medieval period, were grouped together under a name that came from outside their world. Which leads to the question that reframes everything. If Pictishness was not a biological inheritance, then it had to be something else, something constructed, something built, something promoted. And the question of who built it, and why, is where the story turns sharper. The kingdom that did the constructing was called Fortriu. It sat in the north, centered on Moray, and at its core were a people the Romans had named the Verturiones. The Latin name probably comes from a Brittonic root, meaning fortress, which would make the Verturiones the fortress people. They first appear in Roman writing in the 4th century. By the 6th century, their kings were already projecting power across the entire north of Britain. The early evidence is fragmentary but striking. In the late 6th century, St. Columba traveled up the Great Glen to the court of King Bede, son of Maelchon, near the river Ness. Bede later described Bede as a most powerful king. Adamnan, writing the life of Columba, describes the king of Orkney being present at Bride's court, an almost casual detail that carries enormous weight. It means that by the late 6th century, the king of this northern Pictish realm was already overlord of the islands. Pictish hegemony was not a late development, it was already underway. A century later, the consolidation became unmistakable. Bede, son of Bede, ruling from the 670s, is the first king explicitly named in the sources as king of Fortriu. In 685, at the Battle of Dun Nectane, he shattered Northumbrian power in the north of Britain, killed the Northumbrian king Ecgfrith, and pushed the southern frontier of Pictish authority all the way to the Firth of Forth. By the 8th century, Onuist, son of Urguist, had taken the project further. He brought the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata under Pictish overlordship in the west. He raided Northumbria, he fought the Britons of Strathclyde. He extended Pictish power coast to coast across the north of Britain. This is the world in which Pictishness was made. A consolidating dynasty needs a unifying identity. The kings of Fortriu were ruling over a patchwork of long-resident northern tribes with their own histories and their own loyalties. To hold that patchwork together, they needed those tribes to think of themselves as one people, and so a Pictish identity was constructed and promoted from the top down. The genealogies were tidied, older legends were borrowed and reshaped. The story of the 7 sons of Cruithne, the legendary founder of the Picts, gave the kingdom 7 provinces conveniently named after 7 brothers. The neatness is the giveaway. The myth was built to legitimize the political reality the kings of Fortriu had already established. The DNA tells us the people had always been there. The history tells us the identity was made for them. What the kings of Fortriu created was not a nation in any modern sense. It was a political brand. A unifying name imposed on a collection of native northern tribes for the benefit of the rulers who needed them unified. And the language they spoke under that name turned out to be its own complication entirely. This is where the title of the story sharpens. If the Picts were native Iron Age Britons, and if their identity was a political construction stitched together by an ambitious dynasty, then the question of what they actually spoke matters enormously. Were they Celtic at all? The evidence has to be handled carefully, because the answer is yes and no at the same time. Bede listed Pictish as one of the 5 languages of the British Isles in his own day, distinct from English, British, Irish, and Latin. Adamnan's life of St. Columba describes the saint requiring an interpreter to preach to ordinary Picts in the lands around the Great Glen. Whatever Pictish was, it was its own language, separate enough from the Gaelic Columba spoke that ordinary Picts could not follow him without translation. For most of the 20th century, that linguistic separation was used to support a much stranger theory. Some scholars argued that Pictish was older than Celtic entirely, a remnant of a pre-Indo-European tongue that had survived in the far north of Britain when Celtic languages overran the rest of the islands. The theory leaned on the untranslated Ogham inscriptions carved on certain Pictish stones, the unusual matrilineal succession rules, the body modification described in the Roman sources, and the lingering Scythian origin myth. In the 1950s, the scholar Kenneth Jackson proposed that Pictish was actually two languages layered together, a Celtic tongue spoken on top of an older non-Celtic substrate, inherited from the deeper past. The theory held for decades, and then it came apart. As Iron Age archaeology improved and the genetic picture sharpened, the case for a non-Indo-European Pictish substrate weakened. Ogham inscriptions began to yield to Celtic interpretations. The matrilineal succession rules turned out to be less unusual than they first appeared, and the genetic continuity between Pictish individuals and the wider Iron Age British population removed the last reason to imagine a separate ancient people clinging on in the north. Most modern scholars now place Pictish firmly inside the Celtic family. But here is the nuance the title is pointing at. Pictish was Celtic in the linguistic sense. It was not Celtic in the sense the modern imagination uses the word. The Celtic tongue the Picts spoke was Brittonic, the same branch of the family that produced Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. It was not Goidelic. It was not Gaelic. It was a different branch of insular Celtic development, descended from a different line. The popular image of the Picts as part of one undifferentiated Celtic Scotland flattens a distinction that mattered enormously at the time. The Gaelic identity that came to define medieval Scotland was an arrival from the west. It came from Ireland, through Dal Riata, and it eventually replaced the older Brittonic tongue of the north entirely. The Picts were Celtic, but they were not the Celtic Scotland later remembered. They were something earlier and something else. Around 793, the expiration date arrived. The sacking of the Northumbrian monastery of Lindisfarne by Viking raiders is traditionally taken as the start of the Viking Age in Britain, and across the next century, the British Isles were remade by violence none of their kingdoms were prepared for. The Picts were caught in the storm. In 839, the Pictish kingdom of Fortriu suffered a catastrophe so severe that the Irish annals could only record it in the language of disaster. The heathens won a battle over the men of Fortriu. The king of Fortriu was killed. His brother was killed. The king of Dal Riata, who had likely been fighting alongside them, was killed. The annal entry simply notes that others almost innumerable fell there. In a single engagement, the political leadership of two kingdoms was gone. Into the vacuum came Sinead Mac Ailpin, a king of Dal Riata, almost certainly Gaelic in origin. By the middle of the 9th century, he had taken control of what remained of the Pictish kingdom and merged the two realms into something new, the kingdom of Alba, the foundation of medieval Scotland. What followed was not a conquest in the usual sense. It was a slow Gaelicization. Within 2 or 3 generations, the kingdom was being called Alba rather than Pictland. The Pictish language was absorbed into the Gaelic of the new ruling elite. The carving of symbol stones stopped. The old royal genealogies were rewritten to flow into the new Gaelic dynasty. By the 12th century, the English chronicler Henry of Huntingdon could write that the Picts had entirely disappeared, and their language was extinct, and that the old accounts of them now seemed almost fabulous. This is where the textbook story has always ended. The vanishing, the lost people, the mystery. And this is where the modern DNA evidence delivers its quietest and most unsettling correction. The 2013 genome study and the broader work that has followed it found that the genetic signature carried by the Pictish individuals from Fife and Easter Ross is still present today in the modern populations of those exact same regions. It did not move. It did not get displaced. It did not get replaced by an incoming Gaelic population sweeping in from the west. The people who had been there in Iron Age Britain were still there in early medieval Pictland, and they were still there in the kingdom of Alba, and they are still there now. What disappeared was the name, the kingdom, the language, the political identity that the kings of Fortriu had constructed 3 centuries earlier. The bodies that carried the DNA stayed where they had always been. They married into the new Gaelic order. They passed their ancestry down through every generation that followed. The Picts walking around in modern Scotland are not a metaphor. They are the same population, in the same valleys, on the same coasts. The Picts were never who the textbooks said they were. They were not Scythian arrivals from beyond the Black Sea. They were not a single ethnic people with a shared bloodline and a shared origin. They were not a foreign Celtic migration washing up on the northern shores of Britain. They were the long resident inhabitants of the north, given a name by the Romans, organized into a political identity by the ambitious kings of Fortriu, and absorbed into Gaelic Scotland by the chaos of the Viking Age. The chroniclers who wrote that they had vanished needed the story to have an ending. The DNA tells the truth, the documents could not. The bones in the Pictish burials share their genetic signature with the people farming those same fields today. The real mystery of the Picts is not where they went. It is how a people who never actually left came to be remembered as the ones who vanished.